There is an old riddle about a pond and a single lily pad. The lily pad doubles in size every day. Left alone, it will cover the entire pond in 30 days. On what day is the pond half covered? Most people's first instinct is somewhere in the middle, day 15, maybe 20. The actual answer is day 29. For 28 days, the pond looks almost untouched. A small patch of green easy to ignore, easy to assume is harmless. Then in the final day, it doubles one more time, and the entire surface disappears under it, seemingly overnight. Jeff Olson opens his book on exactly this kind of invisible math, because he argues it describes almost every meaningful outcome in a person's life, financial, physical, or relational, far more accurately than the dramatic before and after stories most success literature prefers to tell. Nothing about day 1 through day 28 looked like progress. The outcome was never in doubt from the very first day, once the compounding was already underway. It simply stayed invisible for a very long time before it suddenly was not. Olson's central argument is that the difference between people who succeed and people who do not rarely comes down to one dramatic decision or one large action. It comes down to simple, almost trivially small daily disciplines, repeated consistently enough, for long enough, that their compounding effect eventually becomes undeniable, paired with an equally small set of daily errors, repeated just as consistently, that compound in exactly the same way toward failure. He calls this asymmetry the slight edge, the barely noticeable daily gap between the two paths that produces an enormous difference by the time either path has run its course. In this video, I want to walk through the actual mechanics of his argument, what he says the slight edge specifically consists of, why he insists it is a philosophy rather than a formula, and where, honestly, the book's central metaphor is doing more work than the evidence behind it fully supports. Stay with me. Philosophy over formula. Olson opens with a specific complaint about the entire personal development industry he has spent decades inside. Most success books, he argues, are sold as formulas. Do these 5 specific steps, and you will get this specific outcome, when the actual mechanism of lasting success has almost nothing to do with any particular technique and almost everything to do with a deeper, more durable orientation toward daily action itself. The specific distinction he draws is between knowledge and philosophy. Knowing that exercise, reading, and saving money are good ideas is nearly universal. Almost everyone already knows this. What separates the person who actually does these things consistently from the person who only knows they should is not additional information. It is a philosophy, an internalized belief about how small actions accumulate over time, strong enough to keep a person doing the small thing on the days it produces no visible result whatsoever, which is most days, for a very long time. He is specific about why he considers formulas actively counterproductive rather than simply insufficient. A formula implies a fixed sequence of steps that, once completed, delivers the promised result, which sets up an expectation of a defined finish line. Olson argues real, lasting success does not work this way. It looks less like completing a checklist and more like maintaining a way of operating indefinitely, which means a person waiting for the formula to finish, so the daily effort can stop, is working with a framework mismatched to how the underlying compounding actually functions. Easy to do, easy not to do. This is the specific paradox Olson treats as the engine of the entire book. Every one of the simple daily disciplines he describes, a short walk, a few pages of reading, a modest amount saved, a kind word instead of a harsh one, is genuinely easy to do. The catch, and the reason so few people actually do them consistently, is that each one is equally easy not to do, and skipping it on any single day carries no noticeable penalty at all. The specific mechanism is that neither the discipline nor the error produces an immediate, visible consequence, which means the decision to do or skip it is made almost entirely on convenience rather than on any felt sense of stakes. Olson argues this is precisely why willpower alone is an unreliable foundation for the slight edge. Willpower responds to visible urgency, and these actions, individually, never generate any. What has to replace willpower is the philosophy from the previous section, an understanding held firmly enough to act on without needing daily proof, that the invisible math is running regardless of whether today's result can be seen. He extends this into what he considers the most dangerous version of the pattern, the errors that not only fail to produce immediate consequence, but actually feel pleasant in the moment. A skipped workout that buys an extra hour of rest, an unhealthy meal that tastes better than the healthier alternative. These small errors are, in his account, actively rewarded in the short term, even as they compound toward long-term harm, which makes them considerably harder to resist through willpower alone than a neutral, simply inconvenient discipline would be. The compounding curve. Olson leans heavily on the lily pad image and the broader mathematics of compounding to describe what he calls the curve of slight edge results, a line that stays almost flat for a long stretch of time before turning sharply upward, or in the case of consistent small errors, sharply downward, near the end of a sufficiently long timeline. The specific claim he draws from this curve is that most people quit during the flat part because the flat part looks, from the inside, exactly like failure. A person eating slightly better and exercising modestly for 2 months, with no significant visible change on the scale or in the mirror, reasonably concludes the approach is not working, when in Olson's framing, the compounding was working exactly as expected, simply not yet visible, the same way the lily pad's pond looked almost untouched through day 28. He extends the same curve to the negative direction, describing the accumulation of small errors, a slightly worse diet, slightly less saved, slightly more procrastination, as producing an equally invisible decline for a long stretch before crossing a threshold where the consequences suddenly become undeniable. At which point Olson argues most people mistake the sudden visible crisis for the actual cause, rather than recognizing it as the late, compounded result of years of small, unremarkable choices. The success line. Olson formalizes this into what he calls the success line, a threshold beyond which results become visible and self-reinforcing, and below which, no matter how much genuine progress has actually accumulated, everything still looks and feels like failure from the inside. His specific argument is that the overwhelming majority of people who abandon a worthwhile pursuit, a business, a fitness goal, a skill, do so somewhere below this line, often when they are, in retrospect, closer to crossing it than they believed at the time. The practical implication he draws is that persistence past the point of visible discouragement is not simply a matter of raw grit or tolerance for suffering. It requires trusting the underlying math enough to keep making deposits into an account that refuses, for a long stretch, to show any visible balance, which circles back to his earlier point about philosophy over formula. A person without that underlying trust in the compounding process has no real reason to keep going once the flat part of the curve starts to feel discouraging, and Olson argues this, more than any lack of ability, explains why so many reasonable, capable efforts get abandoned early. He is specific that the success line itself is invisible in advance, which he treats as the central cruelty of the whole dynamic. There is no way to know, from inside the flat part of the curve, exactly how much further remains before results become visible, which means the decision to keep going has to be made without the reassurance of a known distance remaining, based entirely on the accumulated, still invisible math, rather than on any observable milestone confirming the effort is on track, turning knowledge into action. Olson devotes real attention to the specific mechanism by which a person moves from knowing a discipline is worthwhile to actually practicing it consistently, arguing that repetition itself is what performs this conversion, more than motivation, inspiration, or willpower ever could on their own. The specific sequence he describes runs from information, simply knowing a fact, through understanding, grasping why it matters, toward what he considers the only stage that actually changes outcomes, action repeated consistently enough to become habit, and eventually philosophy, a settled, largely automatic orientation that no longer requires daily deliberation to sustain. Most people in his account stop at understanding, mistaking a clear grasp of why something matters for the actual work of doing it, which he treats as one of the more common, quietly self-deceiving patterns in how people relate to their own stated goals. He points specifically to the personal development industry itself as a case study in this stalled sequence, noting that many people consume large volumes of books, talks, and courses, accumulating understanding steadily, while their actual daily behavior remains largely unchanged, mistaking the pleasant feeling of having learned something important for the considerably less pleasant, more repetitive work of practicing it on an ordinary Tuesday when nothing about the day makes the practice feel urgent. Now let us be honest about this book. Olson writes in an accessible, motivational register, and the lily pad metaphor, along with the broader slight edge framing, is genuinely memorable and easy to apply as a mental model for thinking about consistency. That clarity is a real strength, and it is part of why the book has remained popular for years within the broader personal development genre. There is a fair critique worth naming directly, however, regarding both originality and evidentiary depth. Core insight that small, consistent actions compound into large outcomes over time. While familiar to readers of similar books built around the same underlying mathematics of compounding, is presented here primarily through metaphor, personal anecdote, and repeated restatement rather than through rigorous, independently verifiable research, specifically testing the claim across the range of life domains, finances, health, relationships that Olson applies it to. The lily pad math is real and illustrative. Whether human effort and results actually compound with anything resembling that same mathematical cleanliness across the messy, nonlinear reality of an actual career or relationship is asserted with more confidence than directly demonstrated. It is also worth noting Olson's own professional background as relevant context. He built much of his career, including significant financial success, within network marketing and direct sales organizations, industries that rely heavily on exactly this kind of philosophy, consistent small daily actions eventually producing outsized results, as a core recruiting and retention message for representatives, many of whom, in practice, do not achieve the outcomes the philosophy promises. This does not make the underlying psychological observations wrong. It does mean the framework arrives with a specific commercial history worth being aware of, and readers evaluating advice this closely tied to an industry built around persuading people to keep going despite limited visible results have reasonable grounds for additional scrutiny. None of this erases the book's genuine, practical value. The observation that both success and failure are frequently the compounded result of choices too small to feel consequential in the moment is a real and useful reframe, regardless of how thoroughly it has been independently tested as a universal law. So what do you actually take from this? The most useful idea here is recognizing the specific moment you are most likely to quit something worthwhile, which is usually not at the beginning, when motivation is high, but somewhere in the flat, invisible middle, when consistent effort has not yet produced a result that feels proportional to the effort spent. Knowing in advance that this stretch is normal rather than evidence of failure changes how it feels to be inside it. The second useful idea is auditing your own small, easy-to-skip daily choices with the same seriousness you would give a large decision, since Olson's argument is that these are, in aggregate, doing more to determine long-term outcomes than the occasional large decision most people spend far more deliberation on. This audit is more useful when it is specific rather than general. Rather than a vague sense that you should be more disciplined overall, naming the exact daily action or the exact small error that most consistently repeats itself gives you something concrete enough to actually track, rather than a diffuse intention that quietly evaporates the same way most unspecific resolutions do. The third thing is simply this. The gap between the life you are currently building and the one you actually want is rarely explained by one missing large action you have not yet taken. It is far more often explained by a series of small, individually harmless-looking choices, repeated consistently enough in one direction or the other that the invisible math eventually became impossible to ignore. Thanks for watching all the way through. The pond was never half covered on day 15. It was already decided, quietly, from day one.